Hey guys, Tim with Little Crow Gunworks. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to talk brass sizing. Oh boy, more oh boy videos. This is going to be contentious and stir the pot, but that's kind of the status quo for this series. I want to start out by saying thank you guys for all your continued support. The positivity has been incredible. Hundreds and hundreds of comments every video, just reinforcing what we're doing and reinforcing the need for this. And guys are super appreciative overall. You guys are really happy with what's going on, and I'm trying to make these as thorough as I can without getting bogged down too much and in the beginner's hand loading portion of it. This is kind of advanced, but I'm trying to do that in an effort to not make these videos any longer than they have to be. So I appreciate your support and feedback and all that with this. I filmed basically in this video, I'm going to show you how to full length size your brass and bump the shoulder the appropriate amount for your rifle. So I recorded this last fall, not this, but the video portion that I'm going to lead you guys into here was recorded last fall. So there's a couple things I want to say about it. One is, why are we full length sizing? The quick and dirty of it is, Sasha, knock it off. Lay down. That it's the best way to do it. I guess I don't know what else to say. Some guys neck size, I don't recommend it for a couple reasons. I got a visual aid here. Where's my visual aid? This is a big stupid piece of 408 Chi-Tac brass. When you neck size, what happens is you're only squeezing the neck down, right, to accept a new bullet. Now I'm going to do this over here maybe so you can see it better. When you do that, every time you fire it, this shoulder slams up into the end of the chamber harder and harder and harder, and this part of the brass, the web down here right above the extractor groove, keeps growing and growing and growing. And eventually what's going to happen is, if you can get the loaded round to go into the gun, it's going to be really hard to close the bolt. It's not going to want to go in there. Or if it does go in there, when you fire it, it's not going to want to come out. And basically the brass keeps growing and growing and growing until it doesn't want to go in there. And that causes all kinds of inconsistency issues and erratic behavior and on and on. Some people will neck size most of the time, but then they'll full length size every 2 to 3 firings or something, and neck size in between. If that's working for you, great. What I found on average is that a rifle system will be most consistent if you full length size, and that's not just my opinion. I talk a lot about the competitive circles because they're kind of at the leading edge of what works and what doesn't work. And yes, I am saying in this series that a lot of the stuff they do doesn't have a lot of payoff. There isn't really measurable results by what they do, but there are a lot of things that they do right, in my opinion. And basically the long and the short of it is, if you go to any competitive national or world level match, whether it's in PRS, the Precision Rifle Series, or competitive bench rest or F-class or whatever, and you survey anybody that places even in the top 100 at any of those events, nobody there is neck sizing. Everybody is doing what I'm about to show you in this video. Everybody is full length sizing and bumping the shoulder back. There was a time when neck sizing was popular in competitive shooting, but that was decades and decades and decades ago. Some of you guys know who Thomas Speedy Gonzalez is. He's the one that basically pioneered this form of sizing that I'm about to show you, and created his own die to do it, and that style of die eventually became the Redding Type S. Type S stands for Speedy. So that was probably in the early 80s when he did that. So the guys winning have not been neck sizing since I was born. Basically, I was born in 1982. Nobody that's winning has really been neck sizing since then. So anyway, so we'll go into that. I'll have you guys watch the video on how to properly size your brass, set up your dies for bump sizing and all that, and the tools you need for that. and then we'll come back here and I'll just give you a couple notes at the end.
Okay guys, we're going to go over how to set up your resizing die for the brass and cartridge that you're using based on your chamber, not based on what the instructions in the die box tell you to do. So one thing I recommend is whatever die set you decide to get, you get the shell holder that's appropriate for that cartridge, and it goes in that die box and it lives in that die box and it doesn't come out for anything but that cartridge. Don't use the same shell holder for a whole bunch of different cartridges, because inevitably if you lose it or end up with another one, you're going to get them mixed up at some point, and that's going to screw up your sizing and your seating. So get a shell holder that's married to that die box and it stays in that die box. The dies that we're going to be using for this series are the only 308 Winchester dies that I have. I don't know if you can read that. It's their full-length bushing, sizer, and cedar set. High-end competition dies. So they use a neck bushing to size the neck of the case. So what I do first is I figure out what brass I'm going to use, and then I'll load up a few pieces of brass with a generic charge, usually like a grain or a grain and a half under max. And what I'm trying to do is have something that I can take out and fire through the gun and get the brass to size to the chamber all the way, so that when I come back I know what the chamber dimensions are to the shoulder, and also I know the case is fully expanded for when I get water capacity. I know that the case is stretched all the way out to meet the chamber. So then once I have brass that's been fired in the chamber of the gun that I'm going to use it in, then we get our water capacity, as I showed you in that little video clip. And then in order to figure out how to set up your resizing die, you start by measuring what your loaded neck diameter is. So you can see the backdrop. So you measure the outside diameter. This is really hard to do. You measure the outside diameter of your case, of your cartridge neck, your loaded round neck diameter, and you write that number down. So this is about 336. So loaded neck is 336. So I went through the neck sizing bushings that I have, and the largest one I have for 30 caliber right now is a 333. So that's the one we're going to use. That means that when I size the brass, I'm going to have 3 thousandths of neck tension. If you go on the internet, you're going to hear that you need to have 2 thousandths of neck tension, or 1 thousandth, or half a thousandth, or whatever. It doesn't matter nearly as much as you think it does. Having a bushing die gives you something to change if you want to try to tweak. You know, if you get your load development done and you think, okay, well, I'd like to try to get my extreme spreads down or whatever, this gives you something to change, so you can try different neck tensions and see if that helps improve your load. But there isn't a hard fast rule for what's best. There are certain guys that run almost no neck tension, and then there are guys like, just off the top of my head I can think of, Todd Hendricks. He's one of the best 1,000-yard F-class shooters in the world, and he runs so much neck tension he's embarrassed to tell anybody what it is. I would guess it's somewhere around 6 or 7 thousandths. So, and he's one of the best shooters in the world. So there isn't a right or wrong. There isn't a one size fits all. You just have to pick a starting point, try it, and then go from there. So now we know what our loaded neck is. We know what bushing we're going to use to size the neck. Now we're going to start with setting the die. So when you're setting the die to determine how much to resize the brass, you want to loosen the lock ring on the die. So we loosen that up completely so this spins freely. And then we want to take all the guts out of the die. So we take our decapping rod out with our expander ball on it, or expander cylinder, I guess in this case. Take all that out so the die is hollow. Because all we're worrying about right now is sizing the body and getting the right amount of shoulder bump. So we screw that into the press. And what I usually do is I'll screw it all the way down until it meets the shell holder and it's snug. Then I'll back it off one full revolution, which is probably too much. And then I'll just kind of snug up the ring, the locking ring, finger tight. I don't tighten it down. Then what I'll do is I'll take my 3 pieces of brass, and these Widden dies come with a shoulder bump gauge or headspace gauge that you can use to measure to the shoulder of the case. So it goes over the neck. Come up here where you can see it. It goes over the neck and it measures at a certain point on the shoulder. That's how you want to measure brass for sizing. So you know how much you're actually sizing the brass rather than just following the instructions that come with, you know, your RCBS or Hornady die set. They tell you, okay, screw it in until the ram cams over. Well, if you're camming over, you're probably bumping that shoulder back like 7 to 10 thousandths. That's way too much. You're never going to get as precise ammo as if you do it this way. So that's why I'm showing you how to do it this way. So we put our little bump gauge on here. Where's my key for that? Tighten that down. Sticky key. Zero it out, and then we measure our 3 pieces of brass. So we'll start with, I marked these A, B, C when I did the water capacity. A, and we used a Lee universal decapping die to knock the primers out, so that way we could measure the case from the base to the shoulder without any interruption from the primer. You know, sometimes the primer will have cratering, and that cratering can interfere with your ability to get a good measurement. So when I'm doing this, I always use the Lee universal decapping die to knock the primer out first. These are invaluable tools. Everybody should have one. They're $12. Get one. So I use that to knock the primer out. So that's out of the way. Then I measure 3 cases and try to get an average. So I'm measuring to the shoulder, and always when you're using your calipers, when you're pushing up, make sure you always apply the same amount of pressure so you're not forcing it to a number that is inaccurate. So I got 1.609, which means that this, in my experience with this headspace gauge, this barrel is headspaced perfectly. When we say perfectly, we headspace everything to the minimum headspace plus 1,000. So on case A, we have 1.609. On B, we have 1.609. You know, if you loaded up a charge that was too light, these may not all come out the same for you. And if that's the case, use the number from the longest one, 1.609. So all 3 of these are 1.609, which gives me confidence that they fully stretched out to meet the end of the chamber, and I know how big my chamber is. This is the number. So 1.609 is a fired piece of brass. That means we want to bump the shoulder back to whatever amount you decide works for you. But obviously it's got to be shorter than 1.609. I typically like to do 2,000 shoulder bump on non-Magnum cartridges, and I do 3,000 shoulder bump on Magnum cartridges. And sometimes with weird shoulder geometry like Weatherby cases, you might have to do even more than that to make sure you don't get interference in the gun, which I'll show you shortly. So now we have our 3 pieces of brass. Set this aside for now. I like using these Stalwart wood reloading blocks when I'm loading charge weights and stuff. But when I'm sizing, because I don't want to get those all full of lube, I'll use the Frankfurt Arsenal number 2. I bought all the different sizes, but now I find myself just using the number 2. And what I do is I'll put the case mouth down in the hole and leave the body exposed rather than the other way around. Because when you do it the other way around and the case goes down in the tray, you're not lubing the bottom of the case, which is the most important part to lube. Where the neck, you don't really need to lube the outside, and the shoulder, you don't need much lube either. So I think it's a better solution to have the base of the case up. There's a lot of different case lubes you can use. I am promiscuous. I use them all. I don't, I would say for certain cases, certain lubes work better. Hornady One Shot works just fine. I also use Dillon case lube. You can make your own. I also use Imperial sizing wax. That Imperial, I'll grab that quick. So this Imperial sizing wax, I use this for really overbore, like big Magnum stuff, or really square cases like the WSMs or the 28 Nosler or things like that that don't have much body taper and they size hard as shit. This is the stuff you want to use. You just need a little residue on your finger and you just wipe the outside of the case body from the shoulder down to the base, and you don't want to coat it liberally. You just want a thin coating on it, and you don't need any on the outside of the neck, and then you're ready to roll. Sometimes too you can use this, just the old RCBS case lube. This also works on really square, stupid cases that don't like to be sized. It's not quite as good as the Imperial, but I find it works better than like the One Shot or the Dillon case lube for really square stuff. So these have been hit with One Shot just for a little extra precaution. I'll put a little bit on this RCBS lube on my fingers and just make sure they're well coated so that they size nicely and I don't get any weird numbers back. Alright, so now we know what size the case was. The cases are appropriately lubed. Our die is screwed in, screwed in until it touches the shell holder, backed off one turn. We're ready to start. Now this process is a little bit tedious, and sometimes you might have to do it over and over to get the right setting, but it ends up being worth it in the end. It's a lot of setup time initially to get this right, but once you have it right, you basically don't ever need to do it again for the life of the barrel unless you're not going to anneal. If you're not going to anneal, you might have to adjust the die now and then, because what will happen is between firing and sizing, the brass will get work hardened, and after a certain number of firings, you'll run it into your sizing die at the setting that you have had and has worked fine, and all of a sudden it won't size it enough. And that's because the brass has been work hardened, and then you just need to loosen the lock ring and screw the die in a little bit more to make sure you're getting the appropriate amount of bump. But you may only have to adjust the die 2 or 3 times in the life of the barrel, because the brass gets harder and harder as you go if you're not annealing. So now we'll start with the first one. I'll start with case A, I guess. Not that it matters, but we'll start with A. Run it in there. No, I'm going to teach you guys how to run your press appropriately. A lot of guys, when they run their handle, they'll tiptoe it like this, where you see I ran it down real slow, and when we got to the bottom, it bottomed out at the end of the travel, but we barely made any noise. So I'm still at 1.609. What you will notice is that when you start sizing it, the die is, because we're full length sizing, the die is squeezing the body of the brass. So as it starts to actually size the brass, you'll notice that this number that we're trying to reduce by 2 or 3 thousandths actually grows. It actually gets bigger, because what's happening is it's squeezing the body of the brass and the shoulder's getting longer because that material has to go somewhere. So it's actually getting taller because the die isn't screwed down enough to for it to have something to run into. So as you adjust this, you'll be screwing it in. I'm going to do a quarter turn because I know we need to go quite a ways. You'll be screwing it in thinking that it's supposed to get shorter, and it'll actually get longer, which can be really confusing. So now we're going to tiptoe this in here again, which is not the correct way to run your ram on your press for anything, whether it's bullet seating or sizing. So we're still getting 1 and 6/10. We'll do another quarter turn. These are big adjustments just because I'm comfortable with this process. Run that gently. So now we're at a solid 1 and 6/10, almost 6/10 and a half. So now we're getting close. It's actually stretching the die, and as I keep screwing the die in, eventually it's going to bottom out. Oh, I just kind of gave away the secret sauce there. Still 1 and 6/10. Back the lock ring off, tighten it a little more. Now that I know we're getting into some sizing here, I'm going to show you how to appropriately run your ram on your press. I got too much grease on my fingers here. So the way you want to run your handle to make sure you get consistent sizing and consistent seating when you're seating bullets, you want to run this handle like you mean it. So don't be tiptoeing and pussyfooting that case up in there. Once you know it's all the piece of brass is all the way at the back of the shell holder and the case mouth is now in the die, run that thing like you mean it. And then after I run it hard like that all the way to the stop, I'll back it out and just spin the case about a half turn. I know there isn't any run out in the press, but it's just for my OCD brain, I do it anyway. So I spin the case about a quarter to half a turn, run it in there again. And you want to run that handle hard, because what's happening is you're basically sizing the brass, but you're not. It helps eliminate spring back, I guess is the best way to say it. So now we're really stretching. Now we're at 1 and 6, 12, 12 and a half. So now we're actually sizing the body quite a bit, but we're not hitting the end of the die. Let's see what we have here. Now it's coming back a little bit. Oh no, it's still 6/12. Okay. Screw it in a little more. And as I'm doing this, I'm sizing this a bunch, so this piece of brass is going to get a little bit work hardened. And I'll show you what to do about that. Okay, now we're getting there. Now we're down to 1 and 6/09. So now we're actually hitting the end of the die. So remember we got longer. I kept screwing the die in, and now it's pushing it back down to where we started. So now we're actually full length sizing the entirety of the brass, and we're making contact with the shoulder. So now when I screw the die in, we're going to actually start going the right way. One and 6/04/5, so that's a little much. So I'll back that off a little bit. Now what I was going to show you guys was that, you know, if you slowly work this thing down till you get the number you want, this original piece will be a little bit work hardened. So when you get down to where you think you need to be, or you're getting close, set that one aside that you ran in there a whole bunch of times and grab a fresh one and see what you really get. $6.085. So that's half a thou. Screw it in a little more. Looks like these are jumping. Alright, so now I think I'm close, so I'm gonna back this whole thing off together and tighten this lock ring. Drop the Allen key, of course. right, so that should be tight. Yep, that's not spinning freely anymore. Then I'll actually use a wrench, tighten the die down. So now the lock ring is tight to the die is tight to the press. We'll take our last virgin piece, see what we got here. Look at that. So now that we took all the slop out of the system by actually tightening the ring down, we're about right where we want to be. 1 in 607. Remember, we started at 1 in 609. Now we're at 1 in 607. So we have 2 thousandths shoulder bump. And these other two pieces that are oversized, that's not the end of the world. Just load them up and shoot them. They'll stretch out to the chamber. And then the next time you size them, they'll get sized appropriately. So now that we know this piece, now all my letters wore off, but I assume this is PC because it was the third one. We wipe the lube off, and then to make sure we sized it enough, this is important, because after you fire a piece of brass, if it actually stretched out to meet the end of the chamber and filled the chamber, and that piece of brass, you open the bolt and the piece of brass goes flying, if you grab it and try to put it back in the gun, a lot of times it won't go in. Or if it does, when you go to close the bolt on that fired piece of brass, it'll close really hard. So now that this is appropriately sized, what we want to do is we take our rifle and we open the bolt and close the bolt a few times to kind of get a feel for how it feels empty. Then we put our piece of brass in there that's sized, that's bumped back 2 thousandths, and we do the same thing. And what should happen if you're sizing it the right amount, if the brass actually stretched out to the maximum dimension of the chamber, and you actually sized it down 2 thousandths, when you do this, it's going to feel the same with the brass in there as empty. And that's what you want. You don't want where when you go to cam over like this and you go to close the bolt completely, you start to feel pressure. You don't want that, because what that means is you didn't quite size the brass enough. So that piece that you're testing, you can feel a little bit, and you might feel the next piece a little bit, but eventually there's going to be a piece that you don't feel and it's just going to close. And then you might get another piece that it's really hard to close. Well, that means that some of them are slammed up against the end of the chamber, and some sort of are, and some aren't at all. And that's not consistent. So you don't want that. You want to size the brass enough so that, and I usually will test more pieces, I'll size more pieces, and but I only fired 3 rounds today, so I'll usually size more pieces and make sure they all go in the gun without issue. You guys should probably do that too, because if this process is new to you, you should size a bunch of pieces and make sure they all go in without issue, and that the dimension that you lock the die down to is actually going to go in the gun without having any interference. So now that we know the brass is sized perfectly for this chamber in this gun, this die is now set. So now that the body is set and it's sizing the shoulder, or sizing the whole length of the case and pushing the shoulder back the appropriate amount, now we can take our neck bushing and drop that in, and we can take our guts and put that back in. This decapping assembly does have a decapping rod. You can remove it if you want to. I typically leave it in because all the other pieces that I'm going to be sizing are still have the primers in, because I just needed these 3 again to measure the length to the shoulder. So then when you set this up, you drop your bushing in there and you're screwing down your decapping rod assembly. The bottom of this center section is bottoming out on that bushing, and it's sandwiching that bushing between this part and the interior part of the die. So you want to screw it down till it makes contact and it's tight on that neck bushing. Then you want to just crack it loose, because you want that die bushing, or that neck bushing, to be able to self-center. So you don't want to back it off enough that it has slop and it can twist in there. You just want to back it off, just crack it loose so that bushing can self-center on the neck and you won't get run out on your neck. So once you've cracked that loose, then you can tighten down this lock ring. I typically will I just use a channel lock because I'm kind of a barbarian. Get on that lock ring and just snug it. So that way it's not going to come loose accidentally from you messing with the die. And then you always want to check your firing pin or your decapping pin protrusion and make sure it's just enough to knock the primer out, but not so far that your expander ball is going to bottom out in the bottom of the case and bend and screw up your decapping rod assembly. I know because I've done it. All right, so now that the dies are set appropriately, we can get out some more brass. Some brass we're going to be using for the project. Let's get out a few more pieces and just run them through here quick. Notice I'm not being choosy about the pieces, and we're not doing any brass sorting or any of that crap. This is just once fired brass that was fired in a different rifle, which I typically don't recommend if you're starting from scratch, but we're doing this series just to show you guys my process. So I'm not super concerned about every little intimate detail. I just want to show you guys the process, and you'll see in the end results that it doesn't matter that much, especially with a 308. A very non-fussy cartridge. All right, so then now we have these lubed, but our expander ball is in there. These pieces still need the neck sized to make sure that our expander ball has some lube on it and isn't going to bind on the cases. I'll take this RCBS lube and I'll put just a little goomer on the inside of the case mouth, and I'll usually do that on the first piece of every row of 5. All right, so now that piece is completely sized and it's ready to be cleaned. Get a tray going here. All right. And it's important that you lube the inside of the case mouth, because what can happen sometimes if you don't, one, the expander ball can sometimes rip the neck right off the case if it's too tight and there's too much friction. But also, two, what can happen is, remember our 1 in 607 we were after, if it's too tight, where's our piece that was the right size? Okay, I think it was this one. If it's too tight, oh, it's this one. What can happen is when you lift the ram up to pull that expander back through the neck, if it's too tight, it can pull so hard that it pulls your shoulder dimension back to where it was. You know, this brass has a memory, so it's not that hard to get it back to where it was. So if you have too much tension on the expander, when you go to pull the piece of brass out of there, if it comes out really hard, it can yank that neck so hard that it pulls the shoulder back to where it was before we even sized it. So it's a good idea to check that and make sure that once you put the guts back in, it's not screwing up your shoulder dimension. Sorry guys, this is kind of fast and loose just because I'm trying to show you the process without getting too mired down here. So it's a good idea to check a few and make sure that you're still getting the right amount of sizing. It is knocking our old primer out. So now these aren't showing enough sizing. So that means we need to adjust the die a little bit. So crack this loose. Loosen our lock ring. Again, like I said, there's a little bit of massaging at the beginning here. So I added a little bit. screwed the die in a little more to add a little more bump. Again, a little bit of screwing around in the beginning here, but it's worth it in the end to get it right. All right, I'll try this one again. There we go. Again, the reason I'm running this ram so hard is that, you know, this brass has a memory, and if you don't set it hard to the new location, you can get what I just showed you, where it'll spring back and then you haven't sized it enough, and then you gotta adjust your die again. And typically, once it's been fired a couple times in your new chamber or your new rifle or whatever, it develops a memory for that amount of growing and resizing, and then it gets a lot more consistent. I'm laughing because I know there's, I don't know how many of you or what percentage, but I know it's a lot of you that are used to pussyfooting your brass and your loaded rounds up into your dies, and this is like making your skin crawl seeing me slam these things in there. But I've tried all the different ways. I'm telling you guys, this is the way to do it. Same with seating bullets. When you're seating a bullet, you set your bullet on there, you run it up in there. Once you know the bullet is contained within the die and it's not gonna tip or fall out, run it in there. Do the same thing. Slam it home, turn the case, slam it again. When you pull it out and you measure to the ogive, which is the only way to do it, when you measure the ogive, you're going to notice that they are incredibly consistent. Whereas when you are seating bullets and you're pussyfooting it in there and you can't figure out why every time you measure to the ogive it's a different measurement, it's because the neck has a certain amount of tension and you're trying to stuff that bullet in there. And the inside of the neck, especially if you wet tumble your brass and your brass is squeaky clean and like new, when you go to seat a bullet in there, you're trying to override that neck tension, and as the bullet goes in, the neck is grabbing it tighter and tighter, and it doesn't want to go to where you're trying to put it. So in order to override that grab and that neck tension, you want to run it fast so it gets up to the top of the die quickly and then slams into the stop, and that's it. And if you do that, you'll find that your seating depth all of a sudden is incredibly consistent. That's a secret sauce that there's so many guys that have been loading their whole life don't know that. And I show them that trick and they're like, why didn't I learn this decades ago? I could have saved myself so much aggravation. All right. Well, now you know the sizing process. And again, we can, now that this die is correct, we can leave the die. It's just every time we cycle through this brass and size it again, we want to make sure that when we run it up in there and size it, we're getting our 2000s bump. If after 2 or 3 firings we're not getting our 2000s bump anymore, then we just loosen that lock ring and tighten it down, screw it in a little bit more until we get the number we want. And again, you might have to do that every 2, 3, 4 firings, depending on the brass manufacturer and, you know, whatever. There's a lot of variables. How hot you're running the loads and on and on. All right, that's it. Now these are ready to be cleaned.
All right, so I'm sure that raised some eyebrows, but that's the way I do it. I've tried all the different ways of doing things, and I've found that to be the most consistent. A couple things about the equipment that I didn't mention this in the equipment video, but those Widden Gunworks full-length sizing bushing competition dies, I don't think those are 100% necessary for everybody's application. I didn't say this in the equipment video, but the only reason I use those for this series is those are the only 308 dies I have. So I think you can get to a similar place with just plain Jane RCBS green box full length 2 die sets, or Redding or Hornady or whatever. I do think you should be full length sizing. Whose die it is, I don't think really matters. It's just those competition dies allow you to adjust neck tension with a bushing, and then they also have a micrometer seating die that makes it a lot easier to make adjustments as far as seating depth versus like the RCBS where you have the just threaded stem with a lock nut on it, where you kind of are guessing how much you're adjusting every time you thread that screw in, and it's kind of barbaric, but it can still get you to the same place if that's more within your budget to have those sets of dies. So I don't think it really matters. Like, I think you can still shoot similar or the same size groups on average, regardless of what die set you use. It's just those Redding, not the Redding, but the Widden dies that I have, or like a Redding competition bushing die set, the Type S, like I was talking about. They just make things easier, and it makes it easier to adjust and have more flexibility in what you're doing to the brass and how you're seating bullets and the speed at which you can seat them and on and adjust seating depth and on. So it's more of a convenience thing than a necessity. The other thing I would say too is that those Widden sets come with a shoulder bump gauge, like I mentioned, and there's 2 other ways to achieve that one I did mention in the equipment video, where I recommended if your die set doesn't come with a bump gauge, then use the Hornady lock and load headspace kit, where they have different bushings that for different size brass that you can use to measure headspace and measure your brass to the shoulder. The other thing you can do is, if I know a lot of you guys are using our Little Crow Gunworks World's Finest trimmers. These can also double as a bump gauge or headspace gauge. So all you need to do is, it's got to be, for whatever cartridge you're using, you got to have the right trim chamber or the right trimmer. This happens to be our WFT2, but it works with our originals or our big boys to do this trick. All you have to do is pull the cutter out, because these inserts are cut with a chamber reamer, just like a barrel. They work great as a headspace gauge. So all you do is, if you have your virgin brass or fired brass or whatever, make sure there's no primer in it to interfere with your measurement. You just put that in there just like you're trimming brass, and then you measure the whole length. So you measure from the base of the case to the top of the trimmer housing, and you'll get a number, and you write that down and go, okay, virgin brass was, in this case, 4.162. Or you can measure the trimmer and zero it out, like however you want to do it. Just make sure you do it consistently. So I can say, okay, virgin brass is 4.162, and then I go out and fire some, either for gathering water capacity or the initial charge weights that I said to shoot to try to calibrate GRT, or you can do this after you've shot your first ladder test. If you do that, I recommend using whatever the highest charge weight brass that you shot. So what we're trying to do is get the brass to form to the chamber, and the higher the charge weight, the more likely that it actually fully formed to the chamber. So, because sometimes you can get a false reading if your charge weights are really low. It may not expand the brass very much. It may not expand it all the way to the outer limits of the chamber. So I recommend using brass that had a higher charge weight in it and was closer to max pressure to measure your length to the shoulder. And if you do that, whatever dimension that gives you on a fired piece of brass with the primer removed, you can be confident that that's the size of your chamber, and then you can use that dimension to set your sizing die to make sure you're getting the appropriate amount of bump. And just like I showed in the video, run it in there, size it, come back and use your World's Finest trimmer to check it. Did I size it enough? So that's a not commonly known feature of our trimmers, that because they are cut with a chamber reamer, they work great as a headspace gauge. So I think that's it. I'm sure there's I could talk for 100 hours on the sizing process alone, but I think that video that I showed you guys how to do it, I think that was pretty thorough. If you guys do have questions, leave them down in the comments. Again, if there's a common theme where guys have questions about things, I'll try to address it in one of the future videos. But I think that's it. Thanks, guys. Like, subscribe, share with your buddies, all that good stuff. and we'll see you on the next one.